Once, in the bustling city full of tall buildings and busy streets, there lived a family that had everything they could ever want. Andrew, the father, was a successful businessman. He wore suits and ties, drove a shiny car, and provided a beautiful home for his family. The house was big, with many rooms, soft carpets, and sparkling windows that overlooked the city. His wife, Marina, was a beautiful woman who wore fancy clothes and always had a smile on her face. They had 2 children. A sweet little girl named Hope, who was 5 years old, and a baby boy who was just 2 months old. Life in the city was full of excitement and comfort. Marina loved going to expensive shops, eating at fancy restaurants, and spending time with her friends at high-end cafes. Hope had a room full of toys, and her parents gave her everything she wanted. Andrew worked hard but always made time for his family. In the evenings, they would gather around the big dining table, laughing and talking about their day. It seemed like nothing could ever go wrong. But life is unpredictable. One day, Andrew's business started to fail. The deals he made fell through, and the money he worked so hard to earn began to disappear. He tried everything he could to save his business, but nothing worked. The bills piled up, and soon they couldn't afford to live in their big house anymore. The bank took their home, and they had no choice but to move out of the city and into a small, run-down house in a poor village far away. The move was a shock to everyone. The once glamorous Marina couldn't believe what had happened to her life. The house in the village was nothing like their old home. It had only 2 small rooms, no fancy furniture, and the walls were old and cracked. The roof leaked when it rained, and there was no running water. The village was quiet, with dirt roads and simple huts, nothing like the lively city Marina had loved. Andrew tried to make the best of it. He found work as a laborer at a construction site, carrying heavy bricks and mixing cement. It was hard, back-breaking work, and it didn't pay much. But he did it without complaining, knowing he had to provide for his family. He would leave the house early in the morning and return late at night, covered in dust and sweat. But Marina was not as strong as Andrew. She was angry and bitter, blaming Andrew for everything that had gone wrong. She missed the city, the luxury, and the life they once had. Every time she looked around the small, shabby house, she felt hatred towards her husband. She began to see him as a failure, a man who couldn't keep his family in comfort. As time passed, Marina's anger turned into cruelty. She stopped caring for her children. Little Hope, who used to be the center of her mother's world, was now ignored. Marina wouldn't cook meals for the family anymore. Instead, she would leave the house and spend hours wandering the village, talking to other men. She started wearing her old city clothes again, trying to remind herself of who she used to be. But those clothes were out of place in the village, and the people there began to gossip about her. Hope noticed the change in her mother. The little girl was too young to understand everything, but she felt the coldness in her mother's eyes. She remembered the warm hugs and loving words her mother used to give her, but now those were gone. Hope tried to help around the house, even though she was just 5. She would sweep the floors, take care of her baby brother, and do whatever she could to keep the house tidy. But Marina never said thank you. She barely looked at Hope anymore. One day, Hope started to feel sick. Her head hurt, and her body ached. She tried to stay strong, but the fever took hold, and soon she was too weak to stand. She lay on the thin mattress in the corner of the room, shivering and sweating. Her baby brother was next to her, crying because he was hungry, but Hope couldn't feed him. She was too sick to move. Andrew wasn't home. He had gone to work, hoping to earn enough money to buy medicine for Hope. He had seen that she was getting sick, and it broke his heart to leave her. But he knew he had to. Marina, however, didn't care. She saw Hope lying on the mattress but did nothing. Instead, she put on her finest dress, one of the few things she had kept from their old life, and left the house. She walked through the village, her head held high, pretending she was still the rich woman she once was. The villagers watched her, whispering among themselves. They knew she was going to meet one of the men she had been spending time with. Marina didn't care what they thought. All she cared about was escaping the life she now hated. That night, as Hope lay on the mattress, her fever getting worse, Marina was with another man. She laughed and drank, forgetting about her sick daughter at home. Hope, in her weak and feverish state, tried to stay awake. She wanted to wait for her father, who always made her feel safe. But as the hours passed, her eyes grew heavy and she could barely keep them open. The baby beside her had stopped crying and was now sleeping, but Hope was too scared to close her eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Andrew came home. His body was exhausted from the day's work, but his mind was focused on his children. He rushed into the house and saw Hope lying on the mattress, her face pale and her body trembling. His heart sank. He knew he had to act quickly. "Hope, my dear," he whispered, kneeling beside her. He touched her forehead and felt the burning heat of her fever. Panic gripped him, but he didn't let it show. "It's okay, Hope. Daddy's here." He looked around the room, searching for Marina, but she wasn't there. He knew where she had gone, but right now his only concern was his children. He gently picked up Hope in his arms, feeling how light and fragile she had become. Then he gathered the baby, wrapping him in a thin blanket, and hurried out of the house. Andrew took them to the village healer, an old woman who knew how to treat the sick with herbs and prayers. The healer saw the fear in Andrew's eyes and quickly began to care for Hope. She mixed potions and whispered words of healing, while Andrew sat beside his daughter, holding her hand. As the night went on, Hope's fever slowly started to break. The healer gave her more herbs, and Andrew stayed by her side, not leaving for a moment. His heart was heavy with worry, not just for Hope, but for his whole family. He knew Marina was lost to him, lost to the life they had once shared, and he didn't know how to bring her back. The night seemed to stretch on forever as Andrew watched over his daughter. Hope was resting now, her breathing slow and even, but she was still very weak. The healer told Andrew that Hope would need to rest for several days and that she would come by each day to check on her. Andrew thanked the healer with all the money he had earned that day, even though it wasn't much. It was enough to show his gratitude. Carrying Hope and the baby back home, Andrew's mind was heavy with worry. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. His heart ached for the life they had lost, but even more for the family that was falling apart. He tried to remember the woman Marina used to be, but it was hard to see her behind the anger and bitterness she now showed every day. When Andrew returned to their small house, he found Marina there, finally. She was sitting on the bed, looking at herself in a cracked mirror, fixing her hair. She didn't even glance at Hope, who was still in Andrew's arms, or at the baby who was whimpering softly. "Marina," Andrew said, his voice tight with anger he could no longer hold back. "Hope is very sick. She needs her mother. Why weren't you here?" Marina looked at him with cold eyes, her expression unchanging. "I had things to do," she replied, as if that explained everything. She didn't ask about Hope, didn't offer to help. Instead, she stood up and walked to the door, ready to leave again. "Where are you going?" Andrew asked, his voice rising. "Your daughter needs you. Can't you see she's suffering?" Marina paused at the door, but she didn't turn around. "I can't stand being here, Andrew," she said quietly, but there was no emotion in her voice. "This place, this life, it's suffocating me. I need to get away." With that, she left, the door closing softly behind her. Andrew stood there for a moment, stunned by her words. He looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms, and then at the baby, who was now silent. He felt a deep sadness settle in his chest, a sadness that was almost too much to bear. The next morning, Marina returned looking tired and worn out. Andrew didn't say anything to her. He just went about his day, caring for the children and doing what needed to be done. He had given up trying to reach her, to bring her back to the woman she used to be. All he could do now was protect Hope and the baby from the coldness that had taken over their mother. Days turned into weeks, and the situation didn't get any better. Marina spent less and less time at home, and when she was there, she was distant and cruel. She would leave Hope and the baby alone for hours, sometimes all night, without a second thought. Hope, who was still recovering from her illness, tried to take care of her baby brother as best she could, but she was just a child herself. One evening, after another long day of work, Andrew came home to find Hope sitting on the floor, holding her baby brother in her arms. She was singing to him softly, trying to keep him calm. The sight broke Andrew's heart, but at the same time he felt a deep pride for his daughter. Despite everything, she was still so full of love and strength. "Daddy, are you okay?" Hope asked as she looked up at him with her big, tired eyes. Andrew forced a smile and knelt down beside her. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle. "How are you? Are you feeling better?" Hope nodded, though Andrew could see she was still weak. "I'm better, Daddy. I took care of the baby today. He didn't cry too much." Andrew hugged her tightly, feeling tears prick his eyes. "You're such a good girl, Hope. I'm so proud of you." Hope smiled, but it was a small, sad smile. "When will Mommy come back?" she asked, her voice small. Andrew didn't know how to answer that question. Marina was home less and less, and when she was, she barely spoke to Hope or the baby. Andrew didn't want to lie to his daughter, but he also didn't want to break her heart. "I don't know, Hope," he said finally, his voice heavy with sadness. "But I'm here, and I'll always be here for you and your brother. You're not alone." Hope nodded again, seeming to accept his answer. She was only 5 years old, but she already understood that things weren't like they used to be. But she didn't complain, didn't cry. She just held on to her father and tried to be strong, just like he was. As the days went on, Andrew found himself taking on more and more of the responsibilities that Marina had abandoned. He would work all day at the construction site, then come home and care for the children. He would cook simple meals, clean the house, and make sure Hope and the baby were safe and cared for. It was exhausting, but Andrew knew he had no choice. One day the sun was high in the sky, but there was no food in the house. Andrew had gone out early in the morning, desperate to find some money. He had decided to borrow from an old friend, hoping to get enough to buy food for the children. The little money he had made from his hard work was gone, spent on medicine for Hope and basic needs. He had no other choice. Hope was alone with her baby brother. She was hungry and her stomach growled loudly, but she was more worried about the baby. He was crying, his tiny face red and wet with tears. Hope rocked him in her arms, trying to soothe him, but he wouldn't stop crying. She whispered to him, telling him everything would be okay, but deep down she was scared. What if her father didn't come back soon? What if they had to go hungry for the whole day? As the hours passed, the house grew quiet except for the baby's cries. Hope felt weaker and weaker, her small body tired from hunger. She sat on the floor, holding her brother close, trying to keep him calm, but her own tears began to fall. She was just a little girl, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep going like this. Then suddenly the door opened and Marina walked in. She looked different, wearing a new dress that one of the men in the village had given her. Hope's heart leapt with a small bit of hope when she saw her mother. Maybe now, finally, she would help. Maybe she would hold the baby, or at least make some food for them. But Marina didn't even look at Hope or the crying baby. She walked past them as if they weren't there. She went straight to the kitchen, opening the cupboards and the small pantry where they kept what little food they had left. Hope watched her with wide eyes, still holding the baby who was now hiccuping softly from crying so much. "Mommy," Hope called out, her voice trembling. "Mommy, I'm hungry. The baby is hungry too. Can you make us some food?" Marina didn't respond. She just kept rummaging through the kitchen, pulling out some rice and a few vegetables. Hope watched as her mother started to cook, the smell of food filling the small house. Her mouth watered and her stomach ached even more. The baby's cries grew softer, as if he too could smell the food and was waiting to be fed. When the food was ready, Marina sat down at the small table and began to eat. She didn't call Hope over, didn't offer her a single bite. She just ate, slowly and carefully, savoring each mouthful as if she was the only one in the world who needed to eat. Hope's eyes filled with tears again, but she tried to be brave. "Mommy, can I have some too? The baby is really hungry, and so am I." Marina finally looked at her daughter, but there was no warmth in her eyes, only coldness. "No," she said sharply, "this is my food. You can wait until your useless father comes back. Let him take care of you. I'm not your servant." Hope's heart broke at her mother's words. She looked down at her baby brother, who was now whimpering weakly, and felt completely helpless. She didn't understand why her mother was being so mean, why she wouldn't share the food with them. Hope's small hands tightened around her brother, holding him close as if that could protect him from the hunger and the pain. Marina finished her meal and got up from the table, leaving the dirty dishes where they were. Without another word, she walked out of the house again, leaving Hope alone with the crying baby. The door slammed shut behind her, and the house was silent once more, except for the soft cries of the baby and the quiet sobs of little Hope. Hope sat there for what felt like hours, too weak to move, too sad to do anything but hold her brother. She wished with all her heart that her father would come home soon, that he would walk through the door with food and a smile, and everything would be okay again. But as the day turned into evening and the shadows grew longer, there was still no sign of Andrew. Finally, when the night was falling, the door opened again. Andrew walked in, his face lined with exhaustion, but he was carrying a small bag of food. When he saw Hope sitting on the floor, holding her baby brother, his heart nearly broke in two. "Hope, my sweet girl," he whispered, rushing to her side. He took the baby from her arms and then lifted her into his lap, holding them both close. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I'm so sorry you had to go through this." Hope buried her face in her father's chest, her small body trembling with hunger and sadness. "Daddy, Mommy wouldn't give us any food," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "She said we had to wait for you." Andrew closed his eyes, feeling a deep, painful anger inside him. But he didn't let it show. He knew he had to stay strong for his children. He quickly set to work, making a small meal from the food he had brought. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fill their empty stomachs. As they ate, Andrew watched his daughter, saw how tired and sad she was, and he felt a deep sense of failure. He had tried so hard to keep his family together, to provide for them, but it seemed like everything was falling apart. Marina was no longer the woman he had married, no longer the loving mother she had once been. And now his children were suffering because of it. When they were done eating, Andrew tucked Hope into bed, her baby brother sleeping soundly beside her. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "I love you, Hope. I promise I'll make things better. I'll do whatever it takes." Hope looked up at her father with tired eyes, but managed a small smile. "I love you too, Daddy," she whispered back before closing her eyes, finally drifting off to sleep. The morning sun crept into the small house, filling it with light. Andrew hadn't slept much. He had spent most of the night sitting beside Hope and the baby, thinking about everything that had happened. His heart was heavy, weighed down by the sadness and anger that had taken hold of him. As the morning light grew brighter, the door creaked open and Marina walked in. She looked as if she had just rolled out of bed, her hair a mess, and her clothes wrinkled. Without a glance at Andrew or the children, she headed straight to the corner of the room where she kept her belongings. Andrew's anger, which had been simmering all night, boiled over. He couldn't stay silent anymore. His hands trembled, his voice shaking with emotion as he demanded to know how she could leave her own children hungry and crying while she went out and lived as if they didn't exist. Marina didn't answer. She moved around the room, gathering her clothes and stuffing them into a worn-out bag. Her silence only fueled Andrew's anger, making his words louder and more desperate. He couldn't understand how she, their mother, could be so cold and heartless. Didn't she care about them? Didn't she remember what it meant to be a family? When Marina finally turned to face him, her eyes were hard with anger. She didn't want to waste her life in what she called a hellhole. She didn't sign up for this life of poverty and misery. If Andrew wanted to live like this, that was his choice, but she was done. Her words, sharp and full of bitterness, cut through Andrew like a knife. Andrew's heart broke at her harsh words. He pleaded with her, his voice now softer, filled with desperation. He begged her not to leave, reminding her that their children needed their mother, that they could work through this together. He promised they could find a way to make things better, but only if they stayed together. But Marina wasn't listening. She continued packing her things, slinging the bag over her shoulder. She was leaving, and she wasn't coming back. She coldly told Andrew that he could take care of the kids if he wanted, but she was done with this life. Andrew's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, tears streaming down his face. He begged her not to leave them like this, but Marina shook her head, disgusted. She had enough of this miserable life. She called Andrew a fool for thinking she would stay. Without another word, she opened the door and stepped outside, leaving Andrew broken and alone. He sat there on the floor, his heart shattered into a million pieces. The woman he had loved, the mother of his children, had just walked out on them, leaving him to pick up the pieces. He wanted to scream, to cry out in pain, but all he could do was sob quietly, his tears falling onto the cold, hard floor. As he sat there, drowning in sorrow, Madame Magdalene, a middle-aged neighbor who had heard the argument, stepped into the house. She had always been a kind woman, often helping Andrew when she could, bringing over food or watching the children when he had to work late. Madame Magdalene saw Andrew's swollen, tear-filled eyes and felt pity for him. She told him to stop crying, that Marina wasn't worth his tears. The woman never truly loved him, and she didn't deserve his kindness. Andrew, his voice trembling, whispered that Marina was the mother of his children, and that he didn't know what to do without her. But Madame Magdalene shook her head sternly. Andrew was a fool if he thought Marina was ever going to stay. She had been gone for a long time, maybe not in body, but in spirit. She stopped caring about Andrew and the children the moment life got hard. A woman like that didn't deserve his love or tears. Andrew tried to wipe his face, but the tears kept coming. He asked how he could possibly do this alone. How could he raise the children on his own? Madame Magdalene reassured him that he had been doing it all along. He was stronger than he thought. The children needed him, not her. Andrew could give them the love and care they deserved. He didn't need Marina for that. Andrew looked at his sleeping children, their small faces peaceful in their sleep, unaware of the storm that had just torn through their lives. Madame Magdalene was right. He had been the one caring for them, loving them, keeping them safe. He was the one who had been there through the hard times, while Marina had drifted further and further away. Madame Magdalene stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on Andrew's shoulder. She assured him that he would be okay, that he would find a way to make it through this. He wouldn't be alone. She and the other neighbors would help him and make sure he and the children were taken care of. Andrew nodded, though his heart was still heavy with sadness. He didn't know how he was going to move forward, but he knew he had to try. For hope, for the baby, and for himself. Marina was gone, but life had to go on. As Madame Magdalene helped him to his feet, Andrew felt a small spark of strength deep inside him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the first step. He would have to be both mother and father to his children now, and that thought terrified him. But he knew he had no other choice. He couldn't let them down, not after everything they had already been through. Taking a deep breath, Andrew wiped away the last of his tears and turned to face the day. Life had changed, and it would never be the same again. But he still had his children, and as long as he had them, he had a reason to keep going. One day, as Andrew was returning from the market with a small bag of food, he noticed a car pull up near his house. It wasn't often that cars came into the village, so this caught his attention. As the car stopped, a tall man stepped out, dressed in fine clothes that made him stand out among the villagers. Andrew squinted, trying to recognize the man. Then, to his surprise, the man smiled and called out his name. It was David, one of Andrew's old school friends. They had gone to secondary school together and had been close back then. David had always been one of the smartest in their class and was known for his ambition. Andrew hadn't seen him in years. As they greeted each other, David looked Andrew up and down, noticing how much life had changed him. His clothes were worn, and his face was lined with the stress of his struggles. David was in the village for a friend's father's coronation, and he never expected to run into Andrew here. After the initial shock wore off, they sat down to talk. Andrew hesitated at first, but David insisted on knowing what had happened. Slowly, Andrew shared the story of how he had lost everything, the good job, the house in the city, and even his wife. He spoke about the hardship of moving back to the village, the endless struggle to feed and care for his children, and the pain of Marina walking out on them. David listened quietly, his face serious. He could see the hurt in Andrew's eyes, and it moved him deeply. When Andrew finished, David didn't hesitate. He invited Andrew and his children to come back to the city with him. He knew he could help, and he wanted to do whatever he could to lift his friend out of this despair. Andrew was so surprised by the offer. It felt like a lifeline thrown to him just when he thought he might drown. At first, he was unsure, worried about uprooting the children again, worried about leaving behind the little he had built in the village. But when David assured him that he would take care of everything, Andrew felt a glimmer of hope. After all, this was an opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild the life he had lost. The next day, Andrew and his children packed up the few belongings they had and left the village with David. The journey to the city was long, but as they drove, Andrew couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: nervousness, excitement, and a deep, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude. When they arrived in the city, David took them to a modest but comfortable apartment he had rented for them. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was clean and safe, a far cry from the cramped, dilapidated house they had lived in before. Andrew could hardly believe his eyes as he walked through the rooms, touching the walls as if to make sure it was real. David had arranged everything. He hired a nanny to help with the children, especially the baby, who still needed constant care. She was a kind woman with a warm smile, and she took to the children immediately, cradling the baby in her arms and chatting with Hope, who had been so quiet and withdrawn since they left the village. But that wasn't all. David also found Andrew a good job, better than the one he had lost before they fell into poverty. It was an administrative position at a company David was affiliated with, and it came with a decent salary. Andrew would be able to provide for his children again, to give them the life they deserved. When David handed him the job offer letter, Andrew could barely hold back his tears. It was more than he had ever hoped for. Life in the city was different this time around. With David's help, Andrew began to rebuild his life. He worked hard, putting in long hours at his new job, determined to prove himself and make the most of the opportunity he had been given. The children adjusted quickly, thanks to the nanny's care and the stability that the new home provided. Hope even started smiling again, and Andrew noticed that the baby was growing stronger and healthier. News of Andrew's new life spread quickly, especially back in the village where Marina still lived. People whispered about how Andrew, once so sad and broken, had found a new life in the city. They talked about his good job, the nice apartment, and how well he was taking care of his children. When Marina heard these stories, her reaction was not what anyone expected. Marina was now with the man she had left Andrew for, a man who was richer and more powerful than Andrew had been, at least in the village. When she heard about Andrew's success, she felt a mix of disbelief and bitterness. She didn't want to admit it, but the news bothered her. She had left Andrew thinking he was finished, that he would never rise above the tough life they had fallen into. She believed she had made the better choice by leaving him behind. But now, hearing that Andrew had turned his life around, something nagged at her. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that it didn't matter. She had a new life, with a new man who gave her everything she needed. What did it matter if Andrew was doing well? She even told herself that the man she was with now was better than Andrew could ever be, more wealthy, more powerful. She convinced herself that she didn't care, that she had made the right decision. 5 years passed, and Andrew had rebuilt his life in a way he never thought possible. His hard work had paid off, and he had finally decided it was time to move forward and find happiness again. He met a kind and beautiful woman who loved him and cared for his children as if they were her own. They got engaged, and plans for their wedding were well underway. For the first time in years, Andrew felt truly happy. One day, as Andrew was working in his office, he heard a soft knock on the door. When he looked up, he was shocked to see Marina standing there. Her eyes were red from crying, and her clothes were worn and dirty. She looked nothing like the woman who had once walked out on him without a second thought. She stepped inside, and before Andrew could say anything, she began to cry. Through her tears, Marina begged Andrew to take her back. She told him that her boyfriend from the village had left her, that he had gone abroad with another woman, leaving her with nothing. She was desperate and alone, and she realized now how wrong she had been to leave Andrew and their children. She pleaded with him to forgive her, to let her come back into his life. But it was too late. Andrew listened to her quietly, feeling a mix of emotions. He had once loved Marina deeply, but that love had turned into pain and then into a distant memory. Now his heart belonged to someone else. With a calm but firm voice, Andrew told Marina that he was getting married next month. The words seemed to hit her like a blow, and she looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Andrew wasn't cruel, though. He reached into his wallet and handed her some money for her transportation back to the village. "This is all I can do for you, Marina," he said gently. "I hope you find peace." Marina took the money, her hands shaking. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. As she walked out of his office and onto the busy streets, she felt a deep regret that weighed heavily on her heart. She had made so many mistakes, and now it was too late to fix them. The life she had thrown away, the family she had abandoned. They were gone, and there was no way to get them back. As Marina walked through the streets, she felt more alone than she ever had before. She thought about the choices she had made, the moments when she could have turned things around, but didn't. Regret washed over her like a cold wave, and she realized that in chasing after what she thought was a better life, she had lost everything that truly mattered. Now, as she wandered aimlessly, she knew that she had no one to blame but herself. And though Andrew had been kind enough to help her one last time, she knew in her heart that she could never go back to the life she had once known. The family she had walked away from had moved on without her, and she was left alone with her regrets. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from this dramatic tale? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, give us a thumbs up, share it with friends, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.